I may be misstating RPE, but you know what? I don't give a if I'm misstating RPE. You guys are all a bunch of
So you're tacitly admitting that you don't actually understand the thing that you're about to ramble on against for the next 10 minutes. Okay. What's up, guys? Enkiri here, and for some reason, Rip keeps on strawmanning RPE. He made a video on this same exact subject a few months ago, and people with far more experience on the subject than me chimed in and basically shut his ass down about it. But now, for some bewildering reason, he's talking about it again. This past week, he made another video discussing RPE, discussing why it's ineffective, discussing why it's useless, and he's practically begging for a response video. So I figured that I would weigh in now with my 2 cents.
Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.
I'm your Huckleberry Rip, freaking Doc Holliday over here. So let's get to it. Response time, baby. OK Corral style.
If you give yourself permission to not try your numbers today because you're tired, because nobody's ever been tired before when they trained, right? Or because you're hungry, or you were up all night with the baby and all this other shit, you give yourself permission to not even do the first of your work sets with the weight that you know you're supposed to do because you're training, not fucking around in the gym, right? Then you are a pussy.
So look, man, this is a straw man argument. It is a flimsy ass straw man at that. I think that Rip really just wanted an excuse to call everybody a bunch of pussies, and that's the entire reason that he made this video, because what he's saying here isn't even the purpose of RPE. It's not even intended for the type of people who are searching for excuses to skip their workout, right? If you're that kind of guy, if you're looking for making things easier, then RPE is not for you, flat out, point blank. Why even bother with it? Why are you even listening here, right? It's intended, RPE is intended for people who are at an intermediate to an advanced level in the gym, and people who have a tendency to push the bounds, right? People who have a tendency to do more than what's good for them, not less than what's good for them. People who have a tendency to do too freaking much and go too hard too often, too frequently. And I've seen a lot of people like that. I've dealt with a lot of people like that. I used to be a person like that, especially in my younger days. Not every trainee is a ranked beginner who doesn't have a clue, right? That's Rip's main working population. I get that. But he needs to be more explicit. He needs to be more clear in these types of videos exactly who he is addressing when he makes these sorts of blanket statements and blanket arguments. Although maybe I'm completely wrong and I'm giving him too much credit, because he does use himself as an example of somebody who's been training for a really long time who still wouldn't have an idea about how to auto-regulate. So I don't know. But in my experience, there does exist a subset of us guys like me, outside of the bounds of people that Rip is addressing, the bounds of beginner trainees and people who don't really have a clue. And these are guys who are not only proficient in the gym and skilled and relatively advanced and strong and all that stuff, but they are also overzealous, right? I was overzealous for a time. I'm still overzealous sometimes. And with that zeal comes a tendency to push the bounds, to try to find the end ranges and go too far. Inevitably, you end up going too far. And so if Rip tells somebody like me that I should just add 5 pounds to the bar for the rest of forever, well, goddamn, that sounds like the best thing in the world to me, man, because that's all that I really want to do anyway. So I will happily do that shit until I've destroyed myself and destroyed my body. So thank you, Rip. Thank you for giving me permission to do what I've always wanted to do anyway. But see, that's the problem. People like me exist, and we exist in higher numbers than people like Rip seem to think, right? He seems to forget that people like me exist, and the purpose of RPE is to give people like me, people who you would be hard-pressed to describe as somebody who trains like a pussy, a means of modulating their workload, right? Modulating their workload and keeping themselves in check, preventing themselves from pushing the bounds too far, right? My tendency and the tendency of people who are like me, and like I said, there are a lot of people like me, and I know that because I've trained them and I've seen the similarities between me and them, and those sorts of people come to me probably because they see those similarities as well. And our tendency in the gym is not to be a pussy. It's the exact opposite. Our tendency is to keep pushing and pushing and pushing until we've pushed ourselves over the edge. The way that we see it, if we haven't killed ourselves in the process, then we must not be doing enough, right? We must not be working hard enough. Somebody else out there is working harder than us, right? And that doesn't sit right with us. That is what makes us feel like we're being gigantic pussies. And so a system like RPE, if you are somebody like me, gives you a way to cap things, without feeling like you didn't do enough, right? To modulate your training based on the inevitable and daily fluctuations that occur in terms of physical readiness. And so when executed properly, it is in fact the opposite of training like a pussy, right? The entire purpose here is to find the designated threshold for that particular day. Training as hard as you can on that particular day based on your current state of physical readiness. That's literally the opposite of training like a pussy, in my book anyway. Whereas linear periodization, which is actually what I use the majority of time, right? This is actually the way that I program most of the time. It's similar to the methodologies that Rip uses. So don't get me wrong here, don't get it twisted. I'm not knocking linear periodization at all. I still think that it's the best way for most people to train most of the time. The difference is I'm flexible within that framework, because otherwise, the way that Rip prescribes it, where it's so rigid, it simply does not factor life into the equation, right? If the baby literally kept you up all fucking night last night, then maybe going for a PR 3x5 on squats, on heavy squats the following morning isn't really the best move. Maybe pushing it to the following day, the day after you've gotten an appropriate amount of sleep, isn't really being a pussy so much as it is being smart about how you are navigating the process of training. Now, the rest of Rip's video ends up being one big, long, hypothetical straw man scenario that he lays out for us, right? It sounds real good when he's laying it out, but the problem is, it's all just made up. It doesn't really work in reality. And I'll give you guys a brief rundown in his own words of his little straw man argument here so that you can see what I'm talking about. And then I'll just kind of respond to the whole damn thing in one go to culminate my argument.
Numbers in the book say I got to do 355 today for 3 sets of 5. You can say, I feel like shit. And I think I'm just going to stay at, 3 1/4 and do my 3 sets of 5 there because I feel like shit. You said they felt like shit, but remember you videoed them and they were the same speed? That's data. Your subjective perception is bullshit.
So firstly, I want to start off by saying RPE is actually a little bit of a misnomer, right? Perception of exertion is only a part of the equation when RPE is being used properly. And everybody who uses it correctly and uses it appropriately already factors bar speed into the equation when they're calculating their RPE. So this entire hypothetical scenario that he's presented here is really a non-argument. It's a non-factor. It's not really based on anything because bar speed is already a part of the system. The whole point of the system, at least the way that I see it and the way that I describe it to people, other people, is to corroborate your own subjective feedback, right? The way that things feel into the objective feedback that you receive from your video analysis. But Rip gives this scenario where the hypothetical lifter's warm-up sets all feel like shit, right? So part of learning how to auto-regulate properly is learning the difference in feel of a specific weight between when the adrenaline has started to flow later in the workout versus early on in the workout when things are still kind of slow, you're doing your warm-ups, and everything just feels kind of shitty in general. And you have to learn that. You have to learn that that doesn't make that a cap on the training session, right? Because all that it really probably means is that the nervous system isn't quite in full gear yet. So, point blank, if you aren't accounting for bar speed, then you simply are not auto-regulating properly. So his entire story, his entire hypothetical scenario here is bunk. End of freaking story. And the little regaling that he gave us here is simply not relevant. It just does not correspond with proper usage of the RPE framework. Further, there is a fine line between understanding when the nervous system has not really gotten cranking into full gear yet versus everything always feeling like shit, right? I got a little hyperbolic on you guys in my last point there, partly to be funny, but also partly to prove a point about the kinds of fluctuations that you can expect during a training session, the kinds of intra-session fluctuations that are actually just a normal part of training. However, if everything always feels like shit, right? The way that Rip describes it here, everything feels like shit all the time. So you're always just looking for excuses to be a pussy and reduce the training weights. Well, in that case, you do know it's also possible that maybe you're not actually being a pussy. Maybe you're just on the wrong side of the recovery curve. And I think that every intermediate and every advanced lifter already knows that even when things feel really shitty, you can still kind of bully your way into a high performance session, right? The way that Rip describes his hypothetical scenario in the video. He's describing a lifter who's proceeding in spite of red flags indicating that they should not proceed. He's bullying his way through the session. And so if you really need to do that, you can do it. I've done it, and I'm sure that every one of you guys has at some point as well, right? Like, caffeine exists, nose torque exists, cocaine exists, Adderall exists, right? And you can throw caution to the wind and do what you need to do, what needs to be done in order to bully your way into lifting big weights, even on days when your body is not necessarily ready to lift big weights. And you can do that occasionally to little ill effect. Like, let's say it's a competition day, for example. I mean, what are you going to do in that case? You can't really ask all the other competitors if they want to reschedule the meet just because you feel kind of poopy that day, right? So instead, you do what needs to be done. You get out there and you get the job done. You bully your way through it. You create a high performance training session, a high performance lifting session, pretty much out of thin air. But that is not something that should be done as a matter of course, the way that Rip's describing it here, a normal training session. No, that's a last resort. That's something you do every 6 months, if that, right? It's not something that you do just because you were scheduled, just because the program tells you that you're supposed to hit a tough 3x5 today in training, right? If that's something that you have to do regularly, bully your way through the session just to get in the scheduled work, then you're doing it fucking wrong. You're training too fucking heavy, and or you're not recovering properly, whatever, but you're doing it wrong. There's no two ways about it. And if you do that, you are going to stagnate very quickly. You're going to run yourself into the fucking ground, and then you're going to feel like shit all the freaking time, which kind of makes his little story here a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, wouldn't you say? And so that is why a system like RPE can be very incredibly useful for certain training populations, right? It gives you the ability to be flexible, the ability to make audibles, the ability to adjust the program on the fly based on the freaking circumstances of life, man. Just shit you can't prepare for, shit that you can't plan for, right? And then you can compare that to the rigidity of a traditional Western linear progression, which just says, okay, today you do 3 sets of 5 at this specific number, no ifs, no ands, no buts, no candy, and no nuts. And we've already discussed the potential pitfalls of that ideology, and in my opinion, those pitfalls exist regardless of skill level, regardless of if you're a newbie, an intermediate lifter, or an advanced lifter. Even beginner lifters can have shitty days. They'll experience less fluctuations, less absolute fluctuations in performance than an intermediate or especially an advanced lifter will, but they do still experience performance fluctuations, and creating program adjustments instead of having everything be dead, set in stone, 100% rigid is not being a pussy. It's being smart.
Conversely, you can try the 355. And then you look at the video, and lo and behold, all 5 of the reps were exactly the same bar speed. But they felt like shit. And goddamned if you didn't do all 15 reps of a weight you thought was going to be too heavy. Your perceptions are not data.
Rip's analysis of the situation also does not factor mental and nervous stress into the equation, right? The shittier that a given weight feels, the harder that a given weight feels, the heavier that it feels to you subjectively, regardless of what it actually moves like objectively, then the more you are going to have to tap into your nerves and your emotions to be able to lift it successfully. Like I said, regardless of what the objective metrics like bar speed are saying. And when you tap into nerves like this, lifting that given weight, even if it's not objectively difficult, automatically becomes more stressful on the body by default, and will therefore take longer to recover from than if you were lifting that same exact weight in a lowered emotional state. Even potentially if going into a lower emotional state made the bar move slower, right? Just blew your mind with that one. But therefore, the more frequently that you do this kind of thing that he's describing in his hypothetical scenario, the more of a recovery debt that you are going to cause, and the more likely that you are to overreach in terms of your recovery abilities. If you do this all the time, then all that's going to happen is you're going to stagnate, eventually you're going to regress, and you're probably going to injure yourself in the process at some point because you're simply not listening to the cues from your body. Right? If you feel like death all the time, you're not being a pussy, okay? There's something else going on that needs to be addressed.
So you can give yourself permission to deload and call it RPE or some bullshit. What it is pussy. RPE, the P.
Mark Rippetoe loves saying the word. This is just more straw manning because auto-regulating your training is not deloading. They're not the same thing, right? By auto-regulating your training, you're not purposefully making the training easy. You are making it commensurate with your current state of physical readiness on that particular day. Like I alluded to a minute ago, the body is smart enough to know that when something needs to be done, it needs to be done, right? When something needs to be done, you can bully your way through the task. Because of that concept, the body must and will physically rise to the occasion in order to allow you to accomplish that task that it thinks has to be accomplished at all costs, presumably to keep you alive, right? Life, death, stress, recovery, and adaptation. That is all that the body knows, right? And doing this, surviving against the massive weight that was just trying to crush you, puts a massive strain on the body, a massive toll on the body. And if you go to this well too many times, then guess what? One day you will truly find that your body is physically not capable of rising to the occasion this time, right? It is physically not capable of completing the task at hand because you went to that well too many freaking times. And in the process here, you may actually hurt yourself trying. And don't ask me how I know all this because firsthand experience is definitely not the answer. So yes, the body is very smart, right? The body knows that it has to do what needs to be done in order to survive the onslaught and keep itself alive, right? Keep itself going for another day. The difference here, the difference between your body and you is that you, as an intelligent human being with that big old brain in your noggin, you have the capacity to discern when something needs to be done versus when you simply want it to be done. And by discerning between these two subtle but very important distinctions, you can use your best discretion to decide when you should do something versus when you should simply live to fight another day, right? Like I said, the body will always be willing to fight to the death if you force it to. If you tell it that that is what needs to be done, the body will be willing to fight to the death for you. I can promise you that. But that does not mean that fighting to the death is always in the best interest of the body or even in the best interest of your long-term progress in the gym. Unfortunately, however, with Rip's rigid mindset here, fighting is the only option ever. Right? There is no room for nuance. There is no room for adjustment. There's no margin for error. There's no thought or discretion applied to the current situation at hand. There is only bullying your way through. Bullying your way through and lifting the damn weight at all costs. And like I said, that works for a little while, but eventually Every bully has his comeuppance. And so as an intelligent human being with that big old brain that evolution saw fit to provide you with, you may as well freaking use it. And eventually that's going to mean applying some discretion to your lifting, right? Applying some discretion, and yes, occasionally even living to fight another day altogether, or as Rip would call that, being a pussy. Anywho, that is all I got for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and more importantly, I hope that you were able to take something useful away from it. Please remember to smash the like button before you go. Leave me some love in the comments and share this video with any starting strength cultists that you know who may finally need to graduate from the starting strength program. Be sure to visit www.enkirielitefitness.com for online coaching and training programs, and thank you for tuning in. Keep training hard, and I will catch you guys next time.